Before we begin, I'd just like to say one more thing very briefly. Justin reminded me of something that I perhaps should have said. I've been presenting these 4 tasks as though they were a sequence of steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. And logically, I find that to be helpful. But it is problematic in the way that it gives you the impression that, okay, now I've got to practice the first one, and then maybe next week I'll practice the second one. Whereas we could also think of these as each of these 4 is an aspect of a single task. We could think of this as a 4-fold task rather than 4 tasks. And in the example I gave this morning to the lady who asked the question with the meditation interview thing, what I described is probably happening within 2 or 3 seconds, right? Person comes in the room, my reactions, stopping, responding. It's happening at high speed, like life does, unfortunately. We don't have the luxury when we're in social or work situations to say, wait a minute, I've got to go and get my 3rd task a little bit better, ratcheted up before I get ready. No, the real challenge is to convert by presenting it as 4 steps, that's very useful as a didactic device, as a teaching device. It breaks it down in order for us to see more clearly the elements that need to be involved. But in actual life, you don't have that. You can't. Life doesn't break down so neatly. You're called upon to respond now. And in that sense, I think it's helpful to start thinking of these as a single task, which has 4 aspects: embracing, letting go, seeing or noticing the non-reactive space, the stopping, and responding. And also to notice that the first task is already necessarily the 4th task. To fully know dukkha is to be mindful and aware and concentrated, which is part of the Eightfold Path. So, and even weirder is that the way the Buddha defines fully know, pariññā, embrace, is identical to the way he defines nirvana. He says embracing means without greed, without hatred, without delusion. In other words, the embracing is a non-reactive embrace. The 3rd task is already there in the first. The 4th task is already there in the first. And the 2nd task too, likewise, I would argue, is implicit in the letting go. It's an embracing that's also a releasing, which sounds paradoxical perhaps, but I think it makes sense in this context. So that's another sort of way we might, or you may want to think about this as we continue. Okay, I've said enough. Questions, comments, and I'll try and be as brief as I can so as many people can ask as possible.
Something I'm interested in is ritual.
Oh, ritual, yeah.
I thought you'd like that one.
Well, it's already come up once. Someone was already asked me this.
Well, I just remember about 5 years ago, you led a week retreat down at Gaia House. Mm-hmm. I think it was the Insight crowd. And at the end, some of them were saying, oh, could we make up our own ritual? We're lacking ritual.
Uh-huh.
How do we sort of just pilfer it from existing traditions? Do we make it up? Do we learn to live without it? I'm from a different angle. I sit with a Sota Zen group, so I love the ritual. I just ignore the metaphysics. But there's always this bit of a tension between being secular and having a bit of ritual with it.
That's correct. No, thank you for that. I think it's a question that comes up an awful lot in these sorts of presentations. What is the role of ritual in secular Buddhism? And maybe should write a book about it. I think the first question we have to ask before we even go down that track is to say, what do we mean? What is ritual? Is ritual just waving a stick of incense or hitting a bell or chanting a sutta? Well, on the surface, yes. But deep down, what is the function of a ritual in a community? I would offer as a tentative definition that rituals are activities that communities perform as a way of physically or vocally embodying their deepest values. that is, I think, if we're not clear about what ritual means, at the deeper sense, and I think that's a reasonable definition. If you think of any particular ritual, it's people coming together with similar values who formally articulate them in song or silence or some physical posture or gesture that is their way of, in a sense, communally affirming value. Now, I find it kind of strange, actually, sometimes when we've been sitting in meditation retreat and then someone says, I really miss the rituals. They don't seem to recognize that sitting for 45 minutes cross-legged on a cushion with bells going off is not a ritual. Of course it's a ritual, at least in the way I've just defined it. It's a group of people coming together, physically embodying their shared values. So sitting meditation is ritual. And people also ask, well, what is devotion? Where's the role of devotion? And another answer I would have for that is, to me, the act of sitting in Zazen is an act of devotion. Already, you don't have to bow down to Buddha images. Just to sit, fully, totally, with complete commitment, that is a deeply devotional act. Not a devotion to something, some icon, but a devotion to what matters most deeply for you. So I think that's one way we might start this discussion. The other question is, how do rituals emerge? I'm always a little bit wary of people who make up rituals. It's a very new agey kind of thing. Let's go and make a ritual for the spring ceremony. And even some neo-Buddhist groups invent their own rituals, but I somehow, to me, I'm never totally persuaded by these invented rituals. My sense is that rituals emerge organically through the life of a community. They may be borrowing from pre-existing elements. I mean, I suspect our rituals have probably come to reflect elements of Christian worship. I mean, who knows? I don't know. But I do think they emerge organically. I don't think that they can be just invented out of the blue. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they do make them up and then they just become so normative that people just feel they've always been around. But I don't think we can dispense with ritual at all. And I think we must be careful just to reject it out of hand because it seems too religious. All human societies appear to behave in ritualistic ways, I would suggest, however secular they are. I'm sure the Labour Party at its conferences has all sorts of rituals. The ritual is going to the bar and pulling pints. Yeah, backstone, ritual backstone. Okay. Next question.
Slightly related. You had kind of gave a few hints in the first part of your talk about the shamanic interest you held. How do you reconcile that with what you've been speaking about today and ritual and things like that?
Well, it reconciles with ritual very easily because this is a highly ritualized form of practice. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I've participated in medicine ceremonies, always communally, always in a spiritual setting with shamans. And my sense is that this is a way of actually practicing the third task. Yes, I'm sorry.
It probably relates to this, but you spoke earlier about the arts and the place of the arts, and I'd love you to say a little bit more, please.
Well, as luck would have it, in my new book, there's a whole section, all of the writings I've done on the arts.
I started reading.
Oh, you started reading it. So, there's a whole, I pulled together all of my writing on photography, on collage, on imagination, and put it together as the final section of that book, including an unpublished essay on aesthetics. I call it the aesthetics of emptiness, or an anesthetics of emptiness. And to me, the most appropriate metaphor for practice of dharma is the practice of art. In other words, I'm very much against, in a way, and I wouldn't say that, somewhat strongly, the idea that the Dharma practice is somehow a kind of science of the mind, and that this is some kind of technological procedure where if you get every step right, you end up enlightened. Or meditation is a technique. Words like technique, even I've heard people talk of Buddhism as a spiritual technology. That makes my flesh go cold, I'm afraid. In other words, there's no room in any of this for the imagination. Now, my understanding of the Eightfold Path is it starts with vision, with seeing clearly, and then the next step is called Sammasankappa. Now, Sankappa is almost invariably translated as right thought. But again, Sankappa doesn't mean thought. You look it up in the dictionary. It comes from the Pali word kapeti. And kapeti means to organize, to arrange, to structure. It's very much like building or creating something. It's not just about intentions. That's part of it. But it actually has to be about constructing or forming or shaping something. And that to me is very much descriptive of the artistic process. You start with a vision, then you begin to sort of shape and construct and form that vision, and then you articulate it in words and deeds and work. In other words, the first steps of the Eightfold Path can be compared very easily with the steps involved in creating a work of art. You start with a vision, you formulate or you find images and forms construct themselves, actually. Your ego is really not so much part of that process. But at some point, you then make the decision to articulate that form in words or in physical acts or in what they call right livelihood. In other words, forms of life in the world. And so to me, I see my practice, and I see these 4 tasks too, as a framework in which I can also understand the artistic process. It's about embracing totally the situation. Let's say if you're a photographer, I do photography. I try to practice photography through the lens of the fourfold task. I embrace totally what's there. I notice my reactions, my judgments, my aesthetic judgments. What's a nice photo, what's a not nice photo? Put that out of the way. Try to get into a still, non-reactive perspective, and at a certain moment, a decisive moment, I press the shutter. And that's the act. So I go from embracing, letting go, stopping, click. That's a physical act. And I think you could see that, and I see that as the way I write. So I found it very helpful, on the one hand, to see my Dharma practice as equivalent, really, to art practice. But likewise, I think people often in Buddhist, and Zen is a happy exception here. In many Buddhist traditions, the arts are seen either as just as decorative, or they're to produce nice icons and tankas and stuff. You're not ever really encouraged to practice the arts. That's quite unusual. In East Asia, that's less unusual. And that's what I liked about living in the monastery in Korea. Many of the arts were doing calligraphy, all sorts of stuff. And that was great. That somehow validated these practices as an integral part of the Dharma practice itself. So I think to awaken that kind of perspective is very important for some people, especially those who... I've met people who have been artists, and they get into Buddhism, and they're told they shouldn't really... Art is about distraction, it's worldly, whatever. And they stop. And then they don't do it anymore. And I think that's a terrible thing, frankly. I'll just finish with one example. Last year, I was present at a symposium on Buddhism in the arts in the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts. And it brought together 20 people who both self-identified as Buddhist practitioners and as artists. And all of them, including myself, found that when we were in our art world, the Buddhism was not mentioned, it was kept to the side. And when you're in your Buddhist world, the art is sort of kept to the side, it's excluded. And yet, subjectively, all of us agreed that both of these areas in our life were practices. You practice art, you practice dharma, and they're not separate things. As a Buddhist, my practice of art is no different from my practice of dharma. It's just another way of doing the same thing. But it's it's utilizing the imagination, which I think is crucial. In other words, bringing something out from within into a shared public environment in the world is, to me, absolutely central to the Eightfold Path. It's about manifesting and sharing, exhibiting, showing your understanding or your values in a public way.
Stephen, how do you relate the four tasks to anatta?
Anatta, you mean?
Anatta, sorry.
Anatta doesn't really figure in this any more than impermanence does. They would both be dimensions of dukkha. In other words, in the early texts, you have frequently the Buddha speaking of anicca, dukkha, anatta. Sometimes they're called the characteristics of existence, although I don't think he uses that phrase. But I think all three are a very fruitful way of fleshing out what we mean by dukkha. Anatta and dukkha, anatta, anicca and dukkha, to me are just aspects of experience that we tend to ignore or deny, that we need to bring attention to. So fully knowing dukkha means fully knowing anicca, dukkha, and anatta. In other words, it's a more extended version of just dukkha. That's where I would fit it. But of course, philosophically, the notion of not self, etc., would permeate the whole thing. But that's not so helpful. It would find its primary role in expanding the notion of dukkha. Yeah.
Hello. Our modern Buddhism, as it is in Britain and probably also in the States as well, is very white, middle class.
Hey, that's right.
Yeah, we're living in a very multicultural culture. I don't know if you feel that is a problem and we need to somehow be more available to other cultures, or is that an issue for in your opinion?
It's certainly an issue, yeah. And it's something that we agonize about a great deal at Gaia House, for example. We are very concerned, and I've got my Gaia House hat on. We're very concerned that we declare ourselves to be very open to what people of diverse cultures, backgrounds, ethnicities, genders, sexual orientation, whatever it is. But that's, again, a nice sort of white middle class, sort of liberal, tolerant perspective, isn't it? And just by making those statements doesn't have lots of coloured or gay people pouring through our doors. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with somehow making it into a big issue and beating oneself up because there are too many white faces in the room. But on the other hand, I do recognise that the very fact of the very way we set up our retreats and set up our meetings and set up events like this, we are unconsciously, in a sense, assuming that our audience will be people like us. We just naturally do that. And I think in doing so, we are probably unconsciously and undeliberately behaving in ways that would put off people from ethnic minorities if they were to walk into this space. In America, they've got a much bigger history of working with this, and in America now you can have retreats. There's people of color retreats. If you're white, you can't get in. Or they have retreats for LBGQT, whatever it is, LBGT Q, they sometimes say LGBTQ, only for people of those orientations. We have considered doing that at Gaia House. But again, I don't feel too comfortable about that. But when I've spoken to friends of mine who are people of colour, they tell me that when they go into a Vipassana retreat or a Zen retreat, and it's just white people, they don't feel comfortable. They feel that they're kind of a marginal minority. All of their unease about race is not eased in these situations. So I'm fully aware that to meet their needs, it's probably important to create situations where they feel safe. And they use that word. They don't feel safe. You know, a black person in a room full of white people doesn't feel safe. I suspect that's worse in America than here. But nonetheless, it's probably not terribly comfortable, I would think. I mean, I've experienced it the other way around. I've been a whitey in Korea, for example, and have experienced the prejudice from the Koreans. It is an experience that I can sympathize with because I've been subjected to it myself. And, but I don't really have a solution to this problem. That is the other dilemma. And I'd like to think that as we mature as a community, that we will naturally, create structures that will be open and inclusive. But maybe that's just naive. Maybe we really do have to make a conscious effort to do something. I spend a lot of time discussing this stuff and don't really seem to get very far with it. So I'm glad you brought it up. So yes, I do think it's an issue, but I don't want it to become such an issue it kind of crowds out everything else. Pat. Is it Pat?
Actually, I want to say two things. The first is about art.
Art.
I think photography is probably quite unique because I'm not a photographer, but when you were talking about you look, you see, you have your vision, and then you click. And I think in most art forms, you might start with your vision, but you're also creating your vision as you work.
That's right.
That's my experience, which is, I think, ties in with all these tasks not being steps, but all part of one thing. Following on from changing the subject, people talk about bringing Buddhism to the West, but, wherever Buddhism has gone, my understanding is it's taken on characteristics of the local culture.
Yeah.
And sometimes we talk as if the local culture over in the West that Buddhism is going to take on is somehow clinical, academic, whatever, psychology, which for most of us is not where we are. We do still live in a Christian culture or a post-Christian culture. And I'm very interested I'm wondering what you think about how Buddhism is going to change as it comes into contact with our culture. And I already say, people like Jack Cornfield, a lot of them, certainly the modern American Buddhist writers, are writing stuff that could almost be Christian. And I'm thinking again, I overheard two Chinese women who were sitting with us one evening quite a long time ago, and I overheard one of them saying to the other, "Oh, Westerners, they just go on about love all the time." and I thought, yeah, that seems weird to her, but actually it may be what we have to offer to the development of Buddhism.
Right, there's a lot there. I take your point about photography and the other arts, but I also do practice collage, which goes on forever, and books. So yeah, I think photography is a convenient example to make my point. But with the other arts, I don't think, although it might be a work that takes you a year or two to finish, but I still feel very much that it is following a vision. It's exploring different sort of organizational and formal structures, and you learn as you go along. And there are moments in which you pause and you contemplate. I mean, that's to me a very integral part of art, is just stopping and letting yourself absorb what's going on, and then you continue, and then at some point it's finished. So yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think the different arts need to be thought of perhaps in ways that reflect the characteristics of that.
It's really the idea of creating your vision. You start with a vision and you create it as you go on, I think.
That's correct. And then, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you look at the fourth task, the way is to be cultivated, bhavana. The literal meaning of bhavana is to bring into being. In other words, the path is to be brought into being. We say cultivate, because when you cultivate a plant, you bring it into being. But literally, the word is to bring into being. And that is, of course, to create something. It's creativity. There is, I think, implicit in this idea of the path already the idea that the path is a work you create. It's an art work. I don't want to get Oscar Wildish about this, but your life becomes your art, in a way. And someone like Marina Abramovic, have you come across her work? Well, she is the work. Joseph Beuys was another one. But both of these have actually had make quite explicit references to Buddhism, shamanism, meditation. Your second point is a more difficult one to answer. I think one of the differences that might make the difference in Buddhism coming to the West is the fact that as Westerners, we take for granted what we call historical consciousness. The very way you ask that question is already framed in a way that an Asian person probably wouldn't think. In other words, when a very simple example, if, for example, we have a Tibetan Lama standing here and let's say a Japanese Pure Land priest here, and I were to ask, okay, why is Tibetan Buddhism so different from Japanese Pure Land Buddhism? You would probably say, well, because one is a product of Japanese culture, the other is a product of Tibetan culture. That seems obvious, I would suspect. If you ask a Tibetan, and I've actually had this discussion, they will say, no, the reason they're different is because we've got the true dharma and they don't. In other words, the idea that the dharma, the form of the dharma, is actually something that emerges contingently upon the interaction between Buddhist teaching and a host culture, be it Tibet, Japan, Sri Lanka, or Britain, that's not a point that's really appreciated. The fact is, Buddhism is itself a highly impermanent, contingent, historical, human creation. And yet religious institutions like to think that this has always been like this, that our teaching, our lineage, goes back unchanged to the Buddha himself. That's very difficult to really take literally. Inspirationally, yes, definitely. But the idea that you can preserve something which somehow avoids the contamination of history and time, it's very difficult for us to accept. So having said that, historical consciousness, or Western consciousness, is starting at a very different point. It's coming with a different set of assumptions. And arguably, this might lead to the fact that we will have a much more contingent sense of the Dharma that we practice as well. That what we're doing is given our conditions, given our backgrounds, given our culture, given the Christian environment, whatever it is, inevitably how we then articulate what we're doing, how we practice what we're doing, how we communicate what we're doing, how we represent it in art, will be, to some degree, a reflection of those conditions, which are different from the conditions of Tibetans and Japanese and so on. And that's always been the case. That's never not been the case with Buddhism. Even the Buddhism of the Pali Canon is conditioned by the Indian cultural context. It's conditioned by, Brahmanical views and Jain views, and you can't really understand it independently of those frameworks within which it arose. So, but the weird thing is that Buddhism says everything is impermanent, everything's unsatisfactory, everything is not self, everything is empty, everything is contingent, except my tradition of Buddhism. That has somehow escaped all of that stuff It's permanent, it's satisfactory, it's really got a definite identity, it's not contingent. There's a failure sometimes, I think, for Buddhists to recognize their own insights within the tradition that they are part of themselves. Can we self-reflectively turn Buddhism to rethink Buddhism? And maybe that's what's going to happen. I'd like to think so, because I think that's kind of exciting. Ditto, I think, with the imagination. A contingent, fluid, transient, poignant world is one that, to me, is best illustrated through the imagination, through the arts. Not through some sort of dogmatic account of what it's supposed to mean. And this will be a work in progress. I think it's already happening. As I said before, we fail to see some of these elements. We fail to notice that mindfulness emerges out of the Burmese experience of colonialism. It's a contingent factor. Yet we tend to think this is how the Dharma's always been taught. And the monks might even tell us that. They may not notice it either. So I do think it's important to bring historical awareness and understanding into our understanding of the Dharma. Hopefully that will prevent us fixing it as something ahistorical. It might also be a consequence. Christianity, I cannot pretend. I was not raised as a Christian. I never went to church. But I was raised in a Christian culture, and that has informed my moral sense, I think, in a very deep way. Unlike, say, for example, my Tibetan friends, I can watch a Shakespeare play or read the Bible, and it speaks to me. I don't have to understand. I don't have to have a theological definition of God or believe in God to be able to read Gerard Manley Hopkins. God shakes out of the tin foil or whatever. I can relate to that emotionally, that a traditional Buddhist probably would say, what on earth is that all about? So I can't deny that. I can't pretend that I'm not rooted in a Christian, Judaic, Greek society, very much informed by the consequences of the European Enlightenment, and all of these things. These are part and parcel of what constitutes who we are. And that will unavoidably have impacts on how the Dharma evolves in our culture. And I think we do need to be wary of it being co-opted by the psychologists. But on the other hand, if you look at the history of Buddhism, and if you look at how Buddhism has traditionally entered into other societies in its history, it tends to find a sympathetic niche. Like when Buddhism went to China, the Taoists were, hey, this is really cool. We're into meditation. They're into meditation. Let's see what we can learn from this. And so there was a kind of a natural kind of affinity with Taoism, to the point you could almost say that Zen Buddhism could be called Buddhist Taoism. Almost. And at the early, in the Tang period, Zhuangzi, Lao Tzu, these were within the Buddhist canon. The Zen Buddhists took these as canonical texts, the Taoist texts. And that could well, something similar could happen here. Christianity will obviously play a role, but I think for many of us who think of ourselves as post-Christian, it won't be through comparing passages of the Bible with the Pali canon. It'll be more that we bring a sensibility to the Dharma that is distinctively post-Christian, whatever that might mean, instead of just mimicking and replicating traditional Buddhist habits that are inherited from Asia. We could go on and on about this one. Next, this gentleman here who hasn't answered yet, and then Stephen, if we have time.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I wanted to bring up a point about ethics. Uh-huh. So as I see it, your reframing in terms of task brings this question of, the for what to the foreground, if I can say it in that way. And what I heard you say is the question of how to respond appropriately, and the place of ethics is what gets focused on for you.
That's right.
So, but if I think about my experience of going to Buddhist retreats, uh-huh. I haven't encountered a lot of ethics as part of that. What you've defined as morality in terms of the precepts and so on, I mean, that's all there, of course. And there's often a gesturing to questions of ethics. but it's not part, it hasn't been part of my experience of being on retreat. And it's kind of there as something, now you'll go away and you'll do that, right? I'm sure. So, but it's not kind of integral to it. And I've had a little bit of experience outside of Western context with Buddhism, and I get a much stronger sense, at least from that, of a kind of service role that Buddhism plays in a kind of sense of community. So I just wonder if you could offer any reflections on kind of how we got here in terms of the kind of retreat structure that's often put on, and whether or not you think a different kind of teaching has to take place in order to get the kinds of focus on ethics that you want.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Going back to another lady, your question about the diversity issues. The one Buddhist organization that most Buddhists don't know about is called the Soka Gakkai. Who's heard of the Soka Gakkai here? Oh, quite a few of you, okay. Now, they do make an incredible effort to create communities of people who are disadvantaged, of ethnic minority. And if you go to a Soka Gakkai meeting, you'll find that it's not just white people at all. It's very diverse. And another thing that differentiates Soka Gakkai is they don't do meditation retreats. That's completely anathema. Meditation is regarded as something just passé. It's past its sell-by date. It's not needed anymore. They just do chanting. And they chant together in a very it's a ritualized way. It's full of noise. They don't have long periods of silence and staring at the ground. But they're always engaged with each other, and their practice is totally integrated in terms of the formal chanting exercises they do in their small groups and in their larger community, and their commitment to building up social networks by creating community, particularly amongst people who are, who are impoverished or who are somehow off the economic privilege that we may have, who may not be that educated, and are very often people of color. It's the same in the United States. Soka Gakkai is the only Buddhist organization that really embraces ethnic diversity. And I think that could connect to your question. I don't think people who are struggling to survive in a foreign culture like this, who have kids to raise and school, I can't see what going on a silent retreat at Gaia House would possibly do for them, frankly. I mean, how would that speak to their condition? It speaks to the condition, basically, of people who are relatively well off, educated, privileged, who have sufficient leisure time to go and sit for a silence in a week and watch their breath. So I think that the whole question is not just about, are we doing the retreats right, but is the retreat actually a model that is perhaps perpetuating the kinds of biases that we're now questioning? Isn't it set up for privileged white people? I don't know, but that makes me wonder. And I do agree with you that because the retreats are in silence, because they're framed within the 5 precepts, there really isn't, well, again, I can't speak for every retreat. I would hope on my retreats I do address these questions. I like to frame what we're doing in terms of this model, you see. I want to bring I'm probably, for many people, always saying the same thing. But this is basically my shtick. And this shtick is just what I deliver on a retreat, because I do want, very passionately, for the experience you have on a retreat to be integral to your life in the world. If it's not, what is the point of the retreat? I mean, why don't I just go off for a weekend and inject myself with heroin? I'd be much happier. I'm joking about that. But it is, I think, a valid point. And I know that amongst the teachers at Gaia House, for example, we talk about this a lot. We're not unaware of this problem. In fact, someone has just set up at Gaia House a web-based program for people who have done retreats. It's called After the Retreat, What Next? And it's a series of 6 programs that people do online, I think, precisely in order to address those questions. But people feel that the retreat environment should not be compromised by exploring questions that are not actually concerned with your experience on the retreat. And I can sympathize with that. You go on retreat because you want to train your mind in a certain way. And to do that, you need to separate yourself off from the world. That's important. It's a retreat, for God's sake. But the problem is there's often not enough integration time between leaving the retreat and going back to a totally non-Buddhist type environment like Bristol and getting back to your work and your family. And we tell them at the end, it's really important that you bring this practice into your daily life. But we actually give people the necessary tools and skills to do that? Are we actually presenting the practice in a way that would encourage that or, in a sense, assume that, rather than making a few platitudes at the end where we tell people to go off and do it? So it's a big question. And I'm afraid I don't really have a very good answer, apart from just noting the conditions under which we are developing these programs. And one of the reasons we started the Bodhi College, of which there is a flyer on the table, is to try to create programs where people would not be just reduced to the week-long retreat and then off back home again, but we have 2-year programs where groups of people, smallish groups of people, 20, 30 people, meet together regularly 3 or 4 times a year over 2 years. They have work that they do, homework, discussion groups, tutoring that goes on between the formal meetings. And that, I must admit, I find to be far more satisfying as a teacher, because there's a continuity to the retreat. It's not a one-off thing. And maybe that goes on in other groups too, I don't know, where there's a real conscious attempt to really make what you do on the retreat part of a much broader training in being human. So that would be one approach to go. I think there are limitations in the one-off, week-long retreat model, which without necessarily a supportive container prior to and subsequent to those experiences. So then again, the importance of creating Sangha, community, very, very important, because it creates the matrix for deepening your ethical sensibilities and values and connecting them to your contemplative experience in meditation. Yeah, microphone.
This is the best discussion ever at one of these Buddhist days. Thanks for initiating it. I wonder whether some of that, those diversity issues might come out in different ways on the other face of Buddhism, the mindfulness movement, especially if all of the mindfulness or party parliamentary group proposals go through public policy. So actually the British government start to make policies about mindfulness in schools or in the NHS. And so those are places where you're not going to get people like us, like the white upper middle class, whatever, elite Buddhists, the upper middle way. But the question I want to ask, I'm not going to ask what would what would Buddha make of Donald Trump, even though I think that's a great question. But it's rather to try and get round to Brexit. And I thought one way of doing that, sorry, I know we all come here to forget about it, but is what makes Buddhism so compatible with governments and with nation-state building? Because that's what happens in Asia, isn't it, as far as my limited understanding goes. Part of the reason, of course, it gets embedded in the cultures, but it also gets embedded in the governments of the countries as a kind of way of developing their national identity. Like I was just in Myanmar, Burma over Christmas and New Year, and what was astonishing is how, the military junta are practicing, Mahasi Vipassana, while they carry out like a totalitarian dictatorship that George Orwell predicts in 1984. And there's kids selling you 1984, on the streets, because they treat Orwell as a prophet. He predicts what's going to happen in Burma. And then you've got Aung San Suu Kyi, who's, Western educated, but her dad's one of the military rulers who wants a Burmese national identity. she's practicing Vipassana too in the name of democracy. Now, you kind of think, well, that's never going to work in Britain, but it does, because it's not called Buddhism anymore, it's called mindfulness. And they start integrating it into government and into the military, you know, in the States, the military mindfulness stuff. And that fits really well with the militarized version of Buddhism that you get in American popular culture, like Star Wars and, you know, The Matrix. And in terms of art, that's how a lot of people understand Buddhism, is this way of creating the fighter, you know, like the Zen Buddhist, you know, the kamikaze pilot. So what is it about Buddhism that makes it so fickle? And seemingly contradictory, because it's a non-violent, you know, it's a non-violent practice, it's a non-violent religion. What is it about it that's just...
Well, it's a good question.
So corruptible, you know.
I was having this conversation with my friends last night as well. And I was also in Burma. It must have been at the same time as you. I was there the first 2 weeks of January. Because George Orwell wrote this book called Burmese Days. But the joke on the street in Burma is, actually he wrote 3 books about Burma. Burmese Days, Animal Farm, and 1984. Yes, that's true too. Mm-hmm. No, this is true. I don't actually have an answer to your question. I think it would be presumptuous of me to say, oh, well, it's because of this, that, or the other. The reality is, and I think we can even take Buddhism out of this. It's not just Buddhism, it's Christianity. Christianity would be an equally good example, a religion that, you know, that if you really took the teachings of Jesus to heart, there's no room for violence, there's no room for military anything. And yet, that hasn't prevented Christianity from supporting the most terrible oppressions and wars and occupations and discriminations. And Buddhists have done the same. I mean, Westerners like to think of Buddhism sometimes as, you know, as a religion of peace and non-violence that somehow avoided all of these other traps. But if you look on the ground, that's simply not the case. The year before I was in Sri Lanka, same problem. You've got, and it's not, sometimes it's the Buddhist monks who are at the forefront of this kind of discriminatory behavior. You have this thing in Burma called the Bamata, which is the organization of monks who, and these are not just random guys on the street, these are senior sayadaws who are promoting a Buddhism that is anti-Islam, anti-Christian, that sees Buddhism as the natural religion of the Burmese state. Sri Lanka is exactly the same. If you've ever been to the Temple of the Tooth, that's basically a shrine to Sri Lanka. The tooth becomes the symbol of the state, effectively. And in other words, it seems that any human belief or culture or philosophy or religion can be turned towards goals and behaviors that are explicitly in conflict with its own teachings. And that is a conundrum. That is a puzzle. I mean, that's a question for a social scientist, perhaps, to work out. But it's undeniably the case. You can start out with the best possible motives and you end up, you know, supporting some violent war or crackdown against some minority. And the problem is, as soon as Buddhism or Christianity achieves a degree of presence and, I guess, numerical superiority in a political state, then the state somehow identifies with that religion, and it becomes part of a national identity. So you're being a Buddhist, or you're being Burmese, entails you're being Buddhist. Being, you know, Iranian would require your being, you know, Muslim, etc. Perhaps the only way to avoid that is to try to make it as clear as possible that the Buddhism or the dharma that we are practicing has nothing to do with national identity at all. But that too can probably be overridden by if it became popular enough and the right people got in charge? I don't know. Anyone else got an answer to this question? It'd be very helpful. Julian.
It's just reminded me of an article I read in relation to the situation in America, and I'm afraid I can't remember exactly who or where I read it. But it was about sort of early warning signs of a totalitarian state, such as restriction of the media, as one example. But what really struck me, remember it was reviewing some people who've written about this early in the 20th century and saying their words were quite prescient, that one of the protections against a totalitarian state is the valuing of the view of the immigrant, the newcomer, the minority, because they are your teachers, because they see things you don't as the majority group. And that strikes me that is what often vanishes as a particular group becomes more powerful and certain views get solidified, is that there's not a humility or an openness to other views. And perhaps we could conceive of a Buddhist practice as something that could support an openness to views beyond our own, as a technique. Sorry to use that word technique, that crept in there. But, in terms of, it hasn't been mentioned yet today, but new ways of practicing that are coming through, like insight dialogue or relational practice, which are explicitly cultivating ways to be open to other human beings through the kind of dharma gate door that you mentioned, might be particular offerings from the Buddhist tradition to help in this direction. It's just a thought.
Yeah, that sounds great. I hope it happens. But I'm not hugely optimistic that we will somehow find a way of escaping from this dilemma. I think we have to be extremely alert. As to mindfulness, for example, let's go back to the last point you made. It's true that mindfulness could get co-opted to the service of the capitalist economy. And in fact, Slavoj Žižek has said that mindfulness, I think he's also said it about Buddhism, he says mindfulness is the opium of the bourgeoisie. Or the Buddhism is the opium of the middle classes, or something like that. In other words, it renders us more passive and more useful to the development of the capitalist economy. I think we laugh, but I think he's onto something, frankly. And I think this is the danger again of isolating mindfulness apart from an ethical context. Is it could easily be turned into that sort of tool. But I wouldn't worry about mindfulness becoming the national religion. We're quite a long way off from that. It's a good example of how that too could be converted to all sorts of different ends. I'm a little more ambivalent about its use in the military. I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. But I am concerned that it becomes a sort of a lubricant that oils the wheels of capitalism. Sorry?
Question capitalism.
Question capitalism too, yes, I think so. Buddhism, where has Buddhism produced a really rigorous social theory or political theory? It hasn't, really. There's been a few attempts, but I think we've still got an enormous task to do if we really value these kinds of teachings. Can we draw from the core Buddhist values a way of thinking about how we could run a society, how we could operate an economy, how we could run a political system? Buddhism has never done that yet. It's always allied itself with other, often right-wing, militaristic, autocratic governments. Yes?
Ken Jones has written The New Social Face of Buddhism.
Yeah, I know Ken Jones has written The New Social Face of Buddhism, and David Loy has written a whole bunch of stuff about it too. But frankly, I think they're very good attempts at trying to achieve something, but I don't think they actually, to me, they're a sort of blend of sort of left-wing political thinking with certain Buddhist values. But for me, they don't really work. And I think it's important that these works are done, but I think we've got a long way to go, is my sense. Now, poor old Ken Jones. Let's remember Ken Jones for a few moments. Another member of this community, right? When did he die? What, 3 or 4 years ago?
No, last year.
Last year, was it? Oh, okay. See, a pity Ken isn't here. He could have answered this question. And I'm sure he would have enjoyed doing so at length.
I think I'm talking too much, so I'm going to be very brief. I'm involved a little bit in some activist circles, and I think one of the things I find interesting is in ecological and to some extent social activism. There's a real interest in Buddhism and mindfulness, partly around self-care for those people who don't want to burn out, but also a sort of a sense that within these kind of practices is a way of connecting with each other and with the earth in ways that we don't get from other aspects of culture. So
yeah,
I just thought that's quite interesting.
all of that's great. But we've got to stop off in a minute. And I would also argue that we've got to get rid of this words engaged Buddhism. Yeah. I think Buddhism, to me, if it's not engaged, it's not really dharma. The idea that you can sort of add on engagement as a sort of optional extra is part of the problem. That in fact you have to signal that this is an engaged kind of Buddhism, not like the usual stuff. That's a problem because it means that you're kind of acknowledging that Buddhism is a disengaged, renunciant, ascetic, somewhat aloof form of religion. And I think a lot of its forms have in fact done that. And so part of the business here of 4 truths to 4 tasks, the 4 truth model, I think, reinforces a belief system which is effectively about getting out of life rather than affirming life. By shifting to the tasks, you're already presenting it from a completely different optique or perspective that might be helpful. I think of myself as working at the level of sort of the deep conceptual underpinnings of what we're doing. But I don't think, I think it's good that people do activist work and support these different projects and native peoples and rights and so on. But I don't think that will ever be, I don't think that will be as effective as it could be until we've also developed a much more rigorous socio-political philosophy based on primary Buddhist principles. That I think is important. And again, that's not going to happen overnight, I'm afraid. But hopefully one day this will emerge. And it might emerge out of Asia rather than the West, actually. I think a lot might come out of China in the next decades as they recover Buddhism, hopefully in a different way. We'll see. Okay, let's conclude with 10 minutes of silence. Is that okay? And then we'll wrap.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much for sharing your ideas in such a clear and interesting way, and also for the really good discussions, which have been stimulated actually by lots of excellent questions. But thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Thank you.
And thank you. As you can see, not to labour a point, there's some flyers for the Bodhi College there. There's a couple of books which I'm going to take in a few minutes, so if you want to have a look at them. I have a website, and also if you want to follow me on Instagram, I have a practice where I post one picture a day, and I've now been doing this for nearly 800 days. So if you want to follow my glimpses of the world, then you go to, that is my handle, agnostic108 in Instagram. Thank you. All the best.